Mark Osler. I am a professor here, and it's really a pleasure to have the chance to do this. I think it's one of the great things to be at an institution like St. Thomas that we can come up with an idea like this and say, let's do it, and it happens, because it's challenging. I am going to be the prosecutor. I am in the Caiaphas role today. And before we start, I want to just share a little bit that regardless of what this does to impact anyone else, it has been a remarkable thing to be Caiaphas, that there has been such a challenge to have my prosecutorial instincts conflict with faith. And I hope if there's some small part of that we can share with everyone else today, that it will be worthwhile. This is not a guilt, not guilty phase of the trial, the kind that people are normally thinking of as a trial. This is the sentencing phase or the punishment phase of a capital trial. We're doing it under Virginia rules because on Saturday of this week, Jeanne Bishop and I are going to be doing this trial in a church on Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia. One of the reasons that we're doing this is to juxtapose the idea of capital punishment with that of faith, this faith that has at its center a capital punishment process that many would consider to be unfair. Now, that'll mean one thing here in Minnesota. It means something very different in Virginia, where they are the second leading capital punishment state in the nation. We're very fortunate today. Everyone will be introduced at the end, but as the defense attorney for Christ, we have Jeanne Bishop here today, who is a public defender in the Cook County Public Defender's Office in Chicago. And I figured since he was indigent, we would get Jesus a public defender. Also, as the judge today, our own Hank Shea, who is one of my own heroes of lawyering and was before I ever came here, has agreed to serve as the judge. So we're very honored to have him do that. So we're going to begin now.
You do not need to rise. Good afternoon. Let's call this proceeding to order, the sentencing phase. Are counsel ready to proceed?
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor. Mark Osler for the Commonwealth of Virginia. I'm here today with my colleague, Jonathan Scheid.
Your Honor, Jeanne Bishop, on behalf of Jesus of Nazareth, along with my co-counsel, Sarah Summervald.
Fine. Counsel, are you ready to proceed with opening statement?
I am, Your Honor. Just so the court isn't offended, because of the nature of the jury seated here, we will be turned to the side and sometimes have our back to you. We mean no disrespect in doing that.
Fine.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Mark Osler. I represent the Commonwealth of Virginia today. And this is an unusual proceeding. It is very unusual to get to this stage in any case. Now, under Virginia rules, the defendant, having been convicted, now comes before you with two questions in issue. Questions that are going to come to you in the form of a verdict form that you will have to answer at the end of this trial. Now, the first of those questions is this. If the defendant is not executed, is there a probability that he will commit criminal acts which constitute a continuing serious threat to society? If you answer yes to that, you will proceed to answer a second question, which is, in light of all mitigating circumstances, is the punishment of execution appropriate in this case? The Commonwealth is going to be calling two witnesses today. The first of those is a follower of the defendants, Simon Peter. We are calling him because he has a broad knowledge of the activities of the defendant. The second witness that we are going to call is a young ruler, a wealthy young ruler, who will come to the stand and tell you the advice that he got from Christ, the defendant. In fact, the directive that he got. My job here is to prove to you that those special issues should be answered yes, that there is a serious continuing threat to society from the defendant. I'm going to be talking about four things. And as you hear us question the witnesses, you'll hear that we're going for information related to four things. The first is, does he constitute a threat to the family structure that undergirds our society? The second is, does he constitute a threat to the economy of which we're all a part and from which we benefit? The third thing is, does he constitute a serious continuing threat to our ability to protect ourselves as a society? And fourth, we're going to address the question of whether or not he is a continuing threat to the intellectual leadership that we rely on in a society such as this. This may not be easy to hear or to decide, but it may be more important than any of us realize. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Court recognizes counsel for the defendant.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, my name is Jeanne Bishop, and along with my co-counsel Sarah Summervald, we represent this man, Jesus of Nazareth. The evidence at this hearing will show that this man should not be executed because neither of the two factors that counsel mentioned exist. Jesus does not represent a continuing serious threat to society, and there's ample mitigating evidence to show that he should not be executed. First, as to the threat. The witnesses at this hearing will show that Jesus is a man of peace, of nonviolence, of healing, that he spoke in reaffirming ways about the commandments of the law, that he upheld even some of the laws of the Roman occupation. When someone asked him, for example, if taxes should be paid to Caesar, he asked for a coin and said, pay to Caesar what's Caesar's, pay to God what's God's. He paid the temple tax. He cleansed a leper and asked that that person go to the priest and show himself and do the sacrifices and offerings that the law commands. So he does not represent a threat to the society and the law. On the issue of mitigation, the evidence will show that Jesus' entire public ministry was one of goodness, of doing good, of healing, of curing the sick, of helping the lame to walk, of cleansing lepers, of feeding the hungry. And that he did that not only for his own people, his Jewish people, he did it for people who could be considered his enemies. Two of the witnesses that you'll hear from at this hearing are a centurion who worked for Rome, who asked that Jesus heal his servant. You'll also hear from the chief priest's own slave, Malchus, who will testify that he himself was healed by Jesus. So at the close of this hearing, I'm going to ask that you find that these two factors of a serious threat and a lack of mitigation are not present, and that you spare the life of this man.
Thank you, counsel. Government may call its first witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. Government calls Simon Peter.
Simon Peter, please raise your hand. Are you ready to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God?
I am.
Proceed.
Good afternoon, sir. Am I correct, Your Honor? Before I proceed, I do want to identify one thing, and that is that the parties have stipulated that there are two witnesses in this case, Simon Peter being one, Malchus being the other, where they have been subpoenaed to trial, but really are on the other side in terms of their previous affiliations. Malchus is my servant. Simon Peter, obviously, is affiliated with the defendant. And because of that, we have stipulated that we both will be permitted to treat them as if on cross-examination.
And under Rule 611, that's permitted. You may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Simon Peter, you are familiar with the defendant, Jesus Christ, correct?
Yes, he's my master.
And you met him at a time when you were fishing, correct?
Yes.
And he came to you as you were fishing and offered you a different opportunity, correct?
Yes.
And that was to be a fisher of men?
Yes.
And since that time, you have been with him. You have observed what he's done, correct?
Everything.
All right. And so if I was to ask you, for example, about some of the events in his life, about what he has been doing, I want you to be honest about what you saw. And if I ask you about something that you didn't observe, please tell me that, all right? I want to start with an incident in which Jesus sent out 70 men. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And sent them out to distant towns and villages.
To bring his gospel.
Now, when he sent them out with nothing, literally. He sent them out with no sandals,
No, no sandals.
with no second cloak.
Just what we wore.
Okay. And he instructed you that went that if there was a town that didn't welcome you, you were to curse that town.
If we brought peace, and if they didn't want it, we shook the dust off our sandals to leave that town, to leave them.
Okay. I want to move on to something else, and that is, do you recall the advice that was given to a rich young ruler who approached Christ?
Yes.
Okay. Now, we're going to hear from him later, and so I'm not going to ask you about what occurred during that conversation. We'll get that directly from him. But do you recall what Jesus said after the rich young ruler left?
Yes, he said that it's harder for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven.
And he also said, truly I tell you, it will be hard for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven, correct?
Yes, that's what he said.
All right. All right, I want to go to another incident. When Jesus, accompanied by you and others, went to the land of the Gadarenes, if you recall, there were demons that had possessed some of the people in that land. Do you recall that?
Yes, the demon was legion and it had possessed a man.
Okay.
He was bouncing off rocks, he was hollering, he was going crazy.
Now, the defendant removed the demon from that person or persons, correct? And cast it into a herd of pigs?
Yes, the demon was afraid of him and said, if you, what are you going to do to us? And it actually asked to be sent into to the pigs.
And the defendant did what the demon asked him to do. Cast him into the pigs,
Yes.
right, as you just said.
Yes.
And when the demon was cast into the pigs took off as a group and plunged into the sea, didn't they?
Yes, they
And
did.
perished?
They died.
Okay. And after that, the whole town begged the defendant to leave.
They were afraid. They were amazed. This demon had been in their gardens. They had been around. They knew him, and they'd never seen this power before.
And so they asked him to leave. Now, I know that you were there also when the defendant gave a sermon on a mountaintop. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
And one of the things that the defendant said in the course of that sermon was that if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, you should turn the other one also.
He said that.
And he also said, if someone wants to take your coat, give him your cloak as well.
Yes, he said that.
Now, you obviously have been a good student and you have learned these teachings well. I can tell by your responses thus far. Do you recall the defendant saying this, that everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or father or mother or children or fields for my name's sake will receive 100-fold and receive eternal life?
He said that.
And he also said, mothers and brothers said, I have come to set a man against his father and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against a mother-in-law. One's foes will be members of one's own household. You recall that?
Yes, he was teaching us about that God is our Father.
And
we should follow
also,
him.
there was a time when his own mother and brothers came to hear him, came to see him. And he was speaking to a group of people. And they came to him and said, your mother and your brothers are outside. And he said, I have no mother and brothers. And looking around, he said, these are my mother and brothers.
Yes.
Do you recall that?
Yes.
All right. Now, I'm curious, he chose you to be a follower, correct?
He did.
And in some respects, to be a leader as well. Am I right?
Yes, my name was Simon, and he named me Peter, the rock.
Okay. Now, up to this point, you were a fisherman, correct?
Yes.
Now, there are literate men in this land, those who have studied the Torah, those who are learned in the ways of the faith, correct?
Yes, you are one of them.
And were any of them amongst the followers that joined you, the 12?
If you mean were there any Pharisees? No, there were no Pharisees, but Matthew could read.
Okay. So there's one apostle that you can recall who was literate.
Yes, he was a tax collector.
Okay. And in fact, those who could read and analyze and think and understand the history of the faith, the defendant referred to them as a brood of vipers, correct?
Yes.
All right. Now, there's just something very briefly I want to ask you about, and it's this. There was a time, a remarkable moment, when you were out on the water and the defendant walked across the water, correct?
He did.
Okay. Among his other powers are the things that he did, and one that must have been troubling for you, is that there came a time that he said to you, before the rooster crows 3 times, you will deny me 3 times. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Now, earlier, I sent a servant girl to find you. And she went to you and asked, because of your accent, do you know Jesus of Nazareth? And you denied it, didn't you?
I did.
Okay. Now, at the time of the defendant's arrest, you were present for that as well.
I was.
And as the authorities entered the room, came in, you pulled out a sword, correct?
Yes.
And you cut off my slave's ear.
I did. They were coming for him.
All right. Thank you. Counsel?
Cross-examination?
So you first met Jesus when you were in your boat,
Yes.
right? And he was preaching to a crowd of people that was pressing up against him at the shore.
He was.
And he needed to come out away from the crowd so they could hear him and see him.
Yes.
So he asked you to take him out in your boat.
Yes, he
And
did.
you did.
I did.
And so he preached to the crowd from the boat.
Correct.
And you heard what he said.
I heard it.
You heard all of his teaching.
It was amazing.
And when he was done preaching and the crowd was going away, he told you where to cast your net into the sea.
We had no luck. We were getting nothing all day. No, there were no fish.
And when you cast your net where he told you to, you hauled it up and it was full of fish.
More than we could bring in.
And when you got to the shore, you got on your knees before him and said, "Go away from me. I am a sinful man."
Yes, I did. But he didn't send me away.
Instead, he said to you, "Follow me and I'll make you a fisher of men," correct?
He did.
And that's what you did. You followed after him and you heard that Sermon on the Mount that counsel referred to.
Mm-hmm.
And in that sermon, Jesus said, "Do not think I've come to abolish the law of the prophets. I've come not to abolish, but to fulfill."
Exactly.
And he talked about the law as it had existed up till that moment on a number of different topics, correct?
Often.
He talked about being angry with your brother.
Mm-hmm.
He talked about adultery.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And he talked about divorce.
Yes.
And he talked about retaliation.
Yes.
And in each of those instances, he asked people to go beyond the law to a kind of a law of love.
Yes, it was that love is the law. That's what the law has been trying to teach us for the whole time.
And even so far as to go to love of enemies, correct?
Even our enemies.
Now, you saw some examples of him doing that. For example, he cleansed a leper, somebody that was thought to be untouchable.
He did.
And after he did that, he instructed that person not to say anything about it, but to go to the priest and offer sacrifices that Moses commanded for the healing, correct?
Correct.
And you were also present when somebody came to him to test him about paying taxes to Caesar.
Yes.
And somebody said to him, "Should we pay these taxes or not?"
Yes, that's what they asked.
And in response, he asked somebody to produce a coin and asked them whose image was on that coin.
Correct.
And when they responded Caesar, he said, "Render to Caesar what's Caesar's, and to God what is God's."
Yes, they were always trying to trick him, but they never could.
There was an incident, too, where somebody came to you and was demanding of you, "Why doesn't your master pay the temple tax?" Correct?
Yes.
And you asked Jesus about it, and he said, here's how we'll pay the tax. And he produced the coin to pay it. Isn't that right?
Yes, he did. He said, does a father ask his children or someone else to pay the tax? And we're the children, so why would we pay it? But so as not to cause offense, he had me fish, and I pulled the coin out of the fish's mouth, just as he said.
Now, there was a moment where there was a woman brought to him who had been caught in the act of adultery. Is that right?
Yes.
And a crowd surrounded her, and they informed him that she had been caught in the act of this crime that carried a sentence of death.
Yes.
And they asked him what should be done about that.
They did.
And he never said that that law was wrong, correct?
No, he never, no. He
Didn't
never said that.
question the law of Moses, correct?
Never.
What he did is say, let he who is without sin cast the first stone, correct?
Exactly.
And everybody walked away.
They did.
Now, what he was focused on was doing good and healing, correct?
That was his constant message.
And you saw him heal a centurion's servant.
Yeah, it was amazing.
I mean, you saw him granting the request of the centurion to heal the servant. You saw him heal your own mother-in-law in your house.
He did.
And many, and many other people. And you saw him doing some things that were unusual and that he was questioned about. For instance, he healed a woman who was bent over on the Sabbath, correct?
Yes.
And the Pharisees questioned him about that. And he said it's lawful to do good on the Sabbath, correct?
Yes, he did.
And that she should be free from her bondage even on the Sabbath day.
Yes, it's for man, not for, that's what the Sabbath is for.
And you saw him cure a man with a withered hand on the Sabbath.
He did.
And he also said that it was lawful to do good on the Sabbath. And you, at one point, were sent out, as counsel asked you about, as disciples. Is that right?
Correct.
And you were told to do these very same things, to do good.
In his name, we did it.
And you were to preach the kingdom of God.
In his name, we did it.
And you were to heal the sick.
In his name, we did it.
So you did what he asked you to. You became a fisher of men.
Yes.
Now, when he was arrested, you pulled a sword.
Mm-hmm.
And Jesus didn't ask you to bring that sword.
No.
He didn't give you that sword.
No.
He didn't tell you to attack anyone with that sword.
No.
In fact, when you did that, he rebuked you.
Yes.
And he told you to put away the sword.
Yes.
And that those who live by the sword will die by the sword.
Yes.
And those were the last words that he's ever said to you.
Yes.
Nothing further.
Redirect, counsel.
Just very briefly, Your Honor. On the issue of the sword, the defendant did at one point say to you, a time will come for swords, correct?
Yes, he said that.
And that was before you had the sword at the time of the arrest?
Yes, but that's, yes.
But that was the chronology, correct?
Yes.
The second thing is that you just testified that you did what the defendant asked you to do, correct?
Of course.
And one of the things that the defendant asked you to do, I believe, because it was one of his teachings, was that you should not make any oath other than yes, yes, or no, no. Anything more comes from the evil one, correct?
That's right.
And the first thing you did when you sat down was to take an oath?
Yes.
Thank you.
Any recross?
No, Your Honor.
May step down. Government may call its next witness.
Your Honor, the state calls the rich young ruler.
In the interest of time, do you consider yourself sworn? Proceed, counsel.
Good afternoon. Please state your name for the record.
It's Quintus Virilius.
And Mr. Villas, what is your occupation?
I am a government official.
Could you explain a little bit further?
Well, I work at the behest of Caesar in Israel, and I work for the Roman government then, therefore, abroad. And I have land holdings, so I'm a businessman as well in my personal life. And that obviously sort of runs along with my position as a government official as well.
And Mr. Villas, do you have any reason to know the defendant in this case?
I do, yes.
And how do you know the defendant?
Well, he has a reputation as a good teacher and a spiritual leader. So I approached him one day and I asked him, sort of out of curiosity, what I could do to get to heaven and was going to heaven.
And what did he tell you when you asked him that question?
He asked me if I knew the commandments.
And what did you tell him?
I said, yes, I do know them, and I've followed them since my youth.
So after you told him that, what did he say next?
After that, he said there's one more thing yet to do. He said that I needed to sell all my possessions, to give to the poor, and to follow him.
And on a practical level, the advice that he gave to you, what would that mean for you? What would it take for you to follow that advice?
It'd be immensely difficult. I'm a man of many means. I would have to sell my property, some of which I own in conjunction with my family, some of which I own in conjunction with the Roman government. So I would, in a sense, not just be selling my own property, but others as well, as a tenant in common.
And aside from just your property, what would that mean for your job?
Well, I would essentially have to abdicate my position with the government because I owe a duty of loyalty to the Roman government, and Jesus asked me to follow him.
Mr. Aurelius, after he gave you all this advice, what happened next?
I went away and I was frustrated, confused, a little distraught, upset.
Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Cross-examination?
Good afternoon. You came to Jesus. You sought him out.
Yes.
And you called him good teacher.
Yes, ma'am.
And the first thing he said to you was that he stopped you and said, "Why do you call me good?" Right?
Yes, that's correct.
And he said that only God is good.
He did, yes.
And you asked him what you must do to inherit eternal life, correct?
Yes, I did.
And he said to you, you know the commandments, right?
Yes.
And he actually read some of them off to you.
He did, yes.
And he listed them and affirmed that you should follow those commandments.
Yes, he did.
And he said, if you wish to enter into life, keep those commandments.
Yes, he did.
And then you said to him, I've kept all these commandments since my youth. What else still do I lack?
I did say that, yes.
And you said that to him because you felt there was still something lacking, correct?
No, I asked him if there was anything yet to do. Because to me, I mean, it seemed as though I had done everything. So I wanted a definitive answer.
But you wanted to know if there's something else that you lacked besides that. That's what you asked him. What else do I lack besides following the commandments? That was your question to him, correct?
I believe I said, is there anything yet to do?
Refresh our recollection. Can I approach, Your Honor?
Yes, you may.
Showing the witness defense exhibit 1.
Sure.
You take a moment to read that. Let me know when you're through. Sir, I asked you a moment ago if you asked Jesus what else you lacked. Did you do that? What else do I still lack?
Yeah, it was something along those lines, yes.
And then Jesus said to you, the one thing that you should do is to sell what you own, give it to the poor, and follow me. Correct?
Yes.
And he didn't say that everybody should do that, right? He said that you should do that.
Yes, correct.
And you never heard Jesus say to a big crowd of people, everybody here, sell what you own and give it to the poor and follow me, correct?
Well, there were people around when he instructed me.
But he said that to you, right?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, he
Now,
did.
you're a man of great wealth, right?
Yes, I am.
In fact, you could be described as rich.
I could, yes.
And you decided to keep your money and your possessions, and you left him.
Well, I walked away confused, yes, and sad, a little distraught.
Actually, you
after he told
walked away grieving, didn't you?
me. Yes.
You still had your money, but you didn't have your answer about what you lacked, correct?
Correct, yes.
Nothing further.
Any redirect?
No redirect, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you. Excused.
Thank you.
That concludes the government's case.
Your Honor, this time the Commonwealth rests.
Ben's ready to call its first witness.
Yes, Your Honor, our first witness will be the centurion. Malchus.
Well, it looks like I better swear him, so. Do you hereby agree to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Sir, would you please state your name?
My name is Marcus Augustus.
And how are you employed?
I am a Roman centurion.
And what is a centurion?
A centurion is a leader of a troop of somewhere between 80 and 100 Roman soldiers.
And where are you located?
I reside and lead my legion in Capernaum.
And what is the function of you in the group of soldiers in Capernaum?
Centurions and their troops, wherever they are the enforcers of Pax Romana. We are the keepers of the peace.
And who are you ultimately accountable to?
Well, I have authority over my soldiers, but there are senior centurions to whom I answer, and ultimately the Roman emperor.
And where do you personally live?
I live in Capernaum, a couple of blocks from the sea.
And who is in your household?
My family, my wife, my 3 children, and several servants.
And shortly after Jesus began his public life, did you have occasion to hear of him?
I did hear of him, yes.
How did you have occasion to hear about Jesus?
Various people in the town had either had encounters with him or had heard of him and shared news of it with me.
And did you have occasion to learn that Jesus was going to enter Capernaum, your town, on a particular day?
I did hear of that, yes.
When you heard that, what did you do?
I went to meet Jesus.
And why did you go to meet Jesus?
One of my servants was ill, and I had heard that Jesus had cured people, and I was hoping he might cure my servant.
Now, when you do your job as a centurion, do you have a particular uniform or dress that you wear?
I do.
What is that?
It's actually a fairly ornate garment. I'm not wearing it today. It comes with a plumed helmet. It's fairly distinctive.
And were you wearing that uniform on that day that you met Jesus? Now, when you went to Jesus, who was there?
There was a crowd of people, of his followers. I encountered him in the town square, and there were a number of people around him.
And what did you say to him?
I went up to him and said, Lord, my servant is in my house, paralyzed and in terrible distress.
And what did he say to you?
He immediately said, I will come and cure him.
And what did you say?
I answered and said, Lord, I am not worthy to have you under my roof. Just speak the word and my servant will be healed. For I am under authority and I have authority over others. If I say to a soldier, go, the soldier goes. If I say come, the soldier comes. If I say to my servant, do this, the servant does it.
And what did Jesus say in response to that?
He looked amazed and then turned to the crowd that was there and said, truly I tell you, in no one in Israel have I seen such faith as this.
And what did you do next? I'm sorry, what did he say next?
Then he said, go, and it will be done according to your faith.
And what did you do then?
I left the square to head back to my house.
When you got there, what did you discover?
I discovered that my servant had been healed.
And did you learn when he had been healed?
He had been, in the time it took me to go from the town square back to my house, my servant had been healed.
I have nothing further.
Thank you, counsel. Cross-examination?
Thank you, Your Honor. The servant that you speak of, he was actually enslaved, wasn't he?
Yes.
The defendant, when he healed that slave, did he free that slave?
We did not have a conversation about that.
So the defendant did not raise the issue of the enslavement of your servant.
That is correct.
Thank you. That's all.
Any redirect?
No, Your Honor.
Okay, fine. You may step down. Ready to call your next witness?
Yes, Your Honor, we call Malchus to the stand.
Consider yourself sworn.
Yes.
Good afternoon. Will you state your name and spell it for the court?
Malchus, Malchus.
Malchus, you are the slave of Caiaphas, the high priest and prosecutor in this case.
Yes,
And as his slave, you have to do whatever he tells you to do.
that's right.
On the night that Jesus was arrested, you were sent with a crowd of men,
Yes, I was.
and these men were carrying torches
Yes.
and clubs
Yeah.
and swords.
Yes.
When you went to find him in the garden, this armed crowd came in and you found Jesus and his followers in the Garden of Gethsemane.
Yes, we did.
Can you identify Jesus in the courtroom?
Yes. Yes, I can. He's right over there. The blue shirt and tie.
May I ask that
The record will reflect that the defendant's been identified.
Thank you, Your Honor. When you came into the garden with this armed crowd, Jesus asked you who you were looking for.
Yes, he did.
And you said Jesus of Nazareth.
Yes, that's right.
And he said, I'm he.
Yeah, he did.
And then he asked you again, if you're looking for me, I'm he. Let these other men go.
Yeah, that's right.
And he didn't run
No.
or elude you
No, not at all.
or resist.
No.
Did he give any instruction to his followers to run or resist?
No, he didn't.
So he gave no instruction, but one of his followers pulled a sword and cut your right ear off.
That's right.
Now, Jesus immediately rebuked him.
Yes, he did.
In fact, told him to put his sword away
Yeah.
and said that if you live by the sword, you will die by the sword.
Yeah, he said that.
And then he turned to you and touched your ear and healed it instantly.
Yeah, he did.
And you have both of your ears here today.
Yes.
So after Jesus healed you, what happened next?
Well, then we actually arrested him and took him to the high priest, like we were supposed to.
No further questions.
Thank you, counsel. Cross-examination?
Thank you, Your Honor. Now, at the time that this happened, did you hear with your good ear the defendant say, all who take the sword will perish by the sword?
Yes, he said that.
Now, you in fact are a slave, aren't you?
I'm your slave, yeah.
Jesus did not free you, did he?
Um,
Did he free you?
no,
You remain my slave, do you not?
yes.
Thank you, that's all.
Thank you. Any redirect?
No, Your Honor.
Okay, you may step down. Is the defense prepared to rest?
Yes, we do, Your Honor.
Okay, defense rests. Counsel, you ready for closing argument?
Yes, Your Honor. Government closed, we have no rebuttal. I have no rebuttal witnesses. I would like to reserve 3 minutes for rebuttal argument.
Fine.
Ladies and gentlemen, I don't relish the role that I have today. Criminal law is all tragedy. I say this very often because it's true. There is no joy in winning. Because if I win as a prosecutor, it doesn't unkill anyone, it doesn't unrape anyone, it doesn't undo the hurt that has happened. The best that we can hope for in what we do is this, that we prevent some other worse future tragedy from occurring. And that is very important. I started out an opening today telling you that there are two questions that will come before you that you're going to have to vote on. I'm going to address those directly. First, the question of, do the criminal acts of the defendant constitute a serious continuing threat, such as to warrant execution? And second, in light of all mitigation, is execution the appropriate sentence? The answer to both those questions is yes. First of all, on the first question, let's talk about that. Criminal acts. We're talking about criminal acts here. Now, you have already convicted the defendant. That's how we got to this phase of this trial. He was convicted of blasphemy. From his past actions, we know that he would go forward and commit those same acts. So whether or not those acts are criminal or not has already been resolved. So let's talk about the other aspects of what's going on here. Family. Is it a continuing serious threat to society, what he teaches about the family? Teaching that what is proper and appropriate, what he will actively do is turn father against son, turn mother against daughter. Not only that, you heard from Simon Peter that one of the things that the defendant taught, and with such great force that so many people listened, was that one's foes will be members of one's own household. Families aren't perfect, but they certainly are important. What is the threat of undoing families, of having one's foes be within one's own household? That threat is to undo whatever it is that is good in our society, that brings happiness and wealth and pleasure in the future. The economy. What would it do to the economy? What threat is there from the teachings of the defendant, of the blasphemy of the defendant? What does he teach? We heard from Simon Peter. He sent his followers out with nothing, just to go begging. No sandals, no food, no second garment, just out, begging. Is that the nation we want to be? A nation of beggars? And we also heard from the rich young ruler. Is there something wrong with wealth? Is it impossible to get to heaven if you have done things right? We know that he was a virtuous man. He testified today that Jesus did not contest when he said, I have followed all the commandments. I have done what is asked of me. He knew the law, the religious laws of our faith up to that point, and he had followed them. But what the defendant said was, impoverish yourself. You have worked, you have done things right, you've followed the commandments, and now what you have to do is impoverish yourself. That is the ethic, the economic ethic that the defendant has, that he has an amazing ability, we don't see that, to propagate. What does that do to our economy? When those who generate wealth, those who build assets, who make jobs appear and continue and survive, are told, you impoverish yourself, give it to the poor. Who wouldn't want to be poor in that society? And what does that do to the economy? Where would we be? That is a serious continuing threat. And what of our enemies? What is the threat from our enemies in combination with the defendant? As the defendant says, if we're struck on one cheek, turn the other. Those who live by the sword will die by the sword. He impugns our warriors. He says, turn the other cheek, allow them to walk in. How long will this society survive if the message to our enemies is, here's our other cheek? That's a fine virtue, I suppose, in isolation, but that is not the world we live in. There are those who would destroy us. And that invitation, we will turn the other cheek, is inviting that destruction from outside. And finally, intellectual life. The intellectual leadership of our society. Those people who are learned within the faith, learned within the history, the heritage of our culture. The Pharisees, the scribes, those who know the history. The defendant despises them, calls them a den of vipers. Who does he choose? Illiterate fishermen. You heard from Simon Peter, there was one of the followers who could read and write, a tax collector. Meanwhile, those he despised, those who were the Pharisees, those who were the scribes, those who were learned and literate, those that he pushed away, were not a part of that circle. And what does that do to our society? Where are we when our heritage, our history, the code of letters is shut out, and instead we have a fisherman telling us what is, one who cannot pick up a book and read it? That is a serious, continuing threat. Now, on the second question of mitigation, that in light of all mitigation, is death warranted? Well, first of all, consider this. Could we just give the alternative of life in prison? I don't think so. This is a man who can walk on water. So I don't think this is a situation where we can say there's other forms of incapacitation to preserve the fabric of our society. You know, the other thing, too, beyond that, is there's much that the defendant has done that can be construed as good and compassionate and right. But I do wonder, where is that compassion for some of the people that we heard from today? You know, we heard about 2 slaves who encountered Christ. Neither one was freed. They both remain enslaved today. And what about Malchus? He had his ear cut off. Now, Jesus healed it. Came and touched the ear. We heard about that. But couldn't he have just stopped Peter from doing it? Peter testified that Jesus knew he was going to betray him. He was going to deny him 3 times. You remember that testimony. So Jesus is able to know what Peter is going to do. Jesus must have known he was going to cut off that ear. Now, is it compassionate and warm and right to let it happen? Just to make the grand gesture of healing it? The compassionate thing would have been to not let it happen at all. That's where a true heart would have been. In the herd of pigs, this may be very subtle, but if you lived in that village, you would understand. He cast out a demon. Now, the powers that the defendant has, he could have just cast the demon out into the sky or into space. But the demon says, cast me into the pigs, and the defendant complies with that request. And the pigs destroy themselves. And then the townspeople send him out, tell him to go. Their economic livelihood is gone. The herd of pigs destroyed. No wonder they told him to go. And where's the compassion for those people who are now hungry? I will take the opportunity for rebuttal once the defense has had the chance to talk to you. It is all tragedy. And it is a tragic thing I have to ask for, but in the interest of the greater good, I must. And that is execution.
Counsel for the defense.
This man, Jesus of Nazareth, sits with his fate in your hands. Should he live or should he die? That's the decision that you have to make now. And you have to make it based on the 2 questions that you heard about at the outset of this hearing. Is he so dangerous to society? And is there such a lack of mitigating evidence that this man's life should be taken? And the answer to those 2 questions clearly is no. Let's start with the threat. The testimony you've heard is of a man of nonviolence, of peace, who never commanded people to do violence, to do revolt. He never armed people. He didn't even resist his own arrest. He stepped forward and said, I'm Jesus of Nazareth. Arrest me, let these other people go. And when Simon Peter tried to fight back, he rebuked him and mitigated the harm. He healed the ear that was taken. He is someone who affirmed the commandments, who told the rich young ruler that you heard from to follow them. And he even listed them and named those commandments. So he does not represent a threat. What he talked about was the law of love behind those commandments. That's what Peter told you about, and said even to love your enemies. So when a family gets into dispute, as families often do, we all know this, Jesus called on us to love our enemies, including the ones in our own family. As to mitigation, he spent his ministry doing good. You heard testimony. He cleansed lepers. He healed the sick. He cured the lame. And he did that even for people who should have been his enemies, for the centurion, for Malchus, the person who had come to arrest him. He showed that compassion. And I'm asking that we show at least that compassion for him that he showed to others. If you examine the reasons behind executions, behind the death penalty, none of those reasons make sense here. And those reasons are three. Number one, deterrence. That if we have an execution, we can deter other people from doing what Jesus did. But how do you deter someone who has said that he's the Son of God, that he's come to bring the kingdom of God? If anything, execution, I think, would be an incentive for others to make themselves martyrs. Don't do that here. There's also the second reason of retribution, where the society has a right to express its revulsion over heinous crimes and can say, we're going to take vengeance on you on behalf of all of society. But that overlooks the good that this man has done. 3 of the 4 witnesses you heard from at this hearing gave testimony to the acts of goodness that this man did, that the healing, the mercy, the peace that he preached. The third reason for a death penalty is incapacitation, to make sure that this person will never do this again. And we don't need to execute him, to incapacitate him. Rather than turning him into a martyr, lock him up for life. Let him fade into obscurity. Let the crowds move on to some other hero and forget about him, and let him live quietly in prison. We do not need to kill him. The last reason not to kill Jesus actually, I think, comes from our own scripture, and I'm going to read to you from the words of the prophet Isaiah that are probably familiar to you. A shoot shall come out from the stump of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. The Spirit of the Lord shall rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. Righteousness shall be the belt around his waist, and faithfulness the belt around his loins. The wolf shall live with the lamb, the leopard shall lie down with the kid, the calf and the lion the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them. That's the kingdom of God. That's the peaceable kingdom that Isaiah spoke of. And we can't kill our way into that kingdom. That can only be achieved by justice and righteousness and mercy. If we kill this man, Jesus, we're making a mockery of the words of the prophet Micah, who said these words that are so beloved. He's told you, O mortal, what is good, and that is to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God. There is no justice in taking a caged man and snuffing out his life, a helpless caged man, and taking his life. There is no kindness in deliberately taking any human life. And there is no humility in playing God and deciding that we are going to cut short the life that only God, the Creator, can create and sustain. And so I'm asking that we not kill Jesus, not so much for who he is, but for who we are and what we believe, and for the God who created and sustains life. Thank you.
Thank you, Counsel. Brief rebuttal?
Yes, thank you. Justice, yes, but mercy for who? Mercy for the slaves who remain slaves? Mercy for the children whose parents have left because that was what Jesus commanded? For the daughter who's turned against her own mother? I don't know. What I do know is that the fabric of society is pulled tight. That there's so much tension in what we do, in the lives, the wars going on in the world and within ourselves, the economic pressures. The fabric of society seems strong until a thread comes undone. And then it comes apart. When you talk about setting a mother against a daughter, that fabric starts to come apart. What does that mean? That there's a hole. And those little holes become big holes. I may be asking for tragedy, but it's all tragedy. And I'm asking for the lesser of the tragedies.
So this trial is now concluded, and we are each left with the evidence and the arguments to consider in our own minds and hearts and souls and reach our own conclusions. We want to thank and recognize the people who made this possible. So in no particular order, we'll start with Danny Breeze, who took the role of Jesus, remain silent. And again, in the interest of time, I think we'll hold the applause to the end, but let me just run down the roll. Peter, ably played by Phil Steger. The role of the rich young ruler, undertaken by Eric Amdahl. The centurion was our own Professor Jerry Oregon. Malchus, played by Nicholas Cunningham. The attorney for the government second chair, Jonathan Scheib. Attorney for the defense second chair, Sarah Somerville, two of our students. And in particular, we're grateful and want to thank our two main attorneys, the attorney for the government, Mark Osler, and attorney for the defense, Jeanne Bishop. Let's show our appreciation to them.